Clara Benson was a teacher everyone admired. She had a glowing reputation, loved by students and respected by colleagues. To her school community, she was a role model, a person who embodied integrity and professionalism. Yet, beneath that polished exterior, Clara carried a secret that would soon unravel everything she had built. It started with whispers. Funds intended for school programs had gone missing, leaving administrators baffled. Suspicion spread through the hallways like wildfire, and soon, an accusation pointed to an unlikely suspect, Mr. Carter, a dedicated teacher known for his unwavering commitment to his students. But the truth was far more complex. Clara, grappling with a hidden gambling addiction, had stolen the funds herself. Faced with mounting debt and the threat of exposure, she made a desperate decision. Instead of owning up to her actions, she shifted the blame to an innocent colleague, throwing his life into turmoil. As the investigation unfolded, lives were turned upside down. Mr. Carter's reputation was shattered, his career placed in jeopardy, and his family left to grapple with the weight of the accusations. Meanwhile, Clara's carefully constructed world began to crumble under the weight of her lies. This story is more than a tale of crime, it's a look into the devastating consequences of addiction and betrayal. What led Clara to risk everything? How did she convince everyone that Mr. Carter was the culprit? And how did the truth finally come to light? Stay with us as we piece together the events that led to this shocking betrayal and uncover the emotional toll it took on everyone involved. Clara Benson was everything you'd expect a dedicated teacher to be. With her radiant smile and patient demeanor, she had a way of making every student feel seen and valued. Parents spoke highly of her, praising her for her tireless dedication and genuine care for their children. At staff meetings, she often stood out as the teacher who went above and beyond, volunteering to take on extra duties or helping to organize school events. Clara's classroom was a safe haven for her students. She decorated it with motivational posters and colorful charts, creating an environment where learning felt exciting and welcoming. Her colleagues admired her ability to remain calm and collected, even during stressful times. She was the kind of person people looked up to, the kind of teacher every parent wished for their child. But behind the scenes, Clara's life was far from perfect. The bills were piling up at home, her credit card payments were overdue, and her paycheck seemed to vanish before she could even use it. The stress weighed heavily on her, but she never let it show. Instead, she found herself drawn to something she thought could offer a solution: gambling. It started innocently enough, just a few scratch-off tickets and some online slot games to take her mind off things. At first, it was thrilling. She'd win small amounts here and there, just enough to keep her coming back. But as time went on, the losses began to outweigh the wins. Instead of walking away, Clara doubled down, convinced that the next bet would turn things around. Her addiction grew quietly, hidden from those around her. Clara would sit up late at night with her laptop, her heart racing as she placed bets on games she barely understood. She ignored the mounting credit card debt and the sleepless nights, telling herself that she was just one lucky win away from solving all her problems. Meanwhile, at the same school, there was Mr. Carter, a teacher whose approach was vastly different from Clara's but no less effective. Mr. Carter wasn't flashy or outgoing, but he was consistent and dependable. He believed in hard work, honesty, and doing right by his students. Though he didn't stand out in the same way Clara did, he was deeply respected for his unwavering commitment to his job. Mr. Carter's life revolved around his family and his work. He was a husband and father who found joy in the simple things: reading a book, spending time with his young son, or working on lesson plans late into the night. His students knew they could rely on him, and his colleagues appreciated his quiet dependability. Despite their differences, Clara and Mr. Carter had always gotten along. They worked together on school committees, shared occasional chats in the teacher's lounge, and respected each other professionally. But while Mr. Carter lived a life of integrity, Clara's growing addiction began to cloud her judgment. She started to see Mr. Carter as the perfect cover for her actions. He was well-liked, quiet, and, most importantly, trustworthy, qualities that made him an easy target when things began to unravel. What Clara didn't realize was just how far-reaching the consequences of her actions would be. Clara's addiction and Mr. Carter's unshakable reputation were about to collide in a way that neither of them could have foreseen. The decisions she made in the coming weeks would not only shatter her carefully built facade but also drag an innocent man into a nightmare he never deserved. If you've made it this far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more compelling stories like this one to light. Clara Benson never set out to become addicted. For her, gambling started as a harmless escape, a momentary reprieve from the stress that had crept into her life. It began one evening when she came across an ad for an online casino while scrolling through her phone. The idea of winning money quickly and effortlessly seemed too good to ignore, especially with her financial troubles weighing heavily on her mind. At first, it felt innocent enough. Clara made a small deposit and started playing. The flashing lights, cheerful sound effects, and simple mechanics made it all seem like a harmless game. She won $50 on her first attempt, and the rush of excitement was intoxicating. For the first time in a long while, she felt in control, like she'd found a way to fix her problems. But that initial win was a fleeting moment. As Clara continued to play, the wins became less frequent, and the losses began to pile up. Each time she lost, she convinced herself that she was just one bet away from a big win that would make it all worthwhile. The more she lost, the deeper she sank into the belief that she needed to gamble more to recover what she had lost. Her addiction began to seep into every corner of her life. Clara started skipping meals to save money for her bets. Her once meticulous lesson plans became rushed, and her usual enthusiasm for teaching started to wane. At home, her bills went unpaid, and her bank account was frequently overdrawn. She told herself that this was temporary, that she could quit as soon as she won enough to catch up on her debts. But gambling is a game designed to keep people coming back, and Clara was no exception. Every loss pushed her further into desperation, and every win fueled the illusion that she was getting closer to solving her problems. As her addiction grew, Clara began taking greater risks. She started borrowing money from friends and family, crafting elaborate excuses about unexpected expenses. She pawned her jewelry and even dipped into her savings account, all in the hope of chasing that elusive big win. The turning point came when Clara realized her personal funds weren't enough to sustain her gambling habit. The school's budget, which she had access to as part of her administrative duties, suddenly seemed like a tempting solution. At first, she resisted the idea, horrified by the thought of stealing from the very institution she loved so much. But desperation has a way of silencing moral objections. Clara told herself it was just a loan, that she would repay the money as soon as she won big. She justified her actions by convincing herself that the school wouldn't even notice the missing funds, especially if she kept meticulous records to cover her tracks. The first time she transferred money from the school's account to her own, her hands were trembling. She stayed up all night, staring at her phone, refreshing the online casino app as she gambled away every cent. The thrill of playing was matched only by the crushing guilt she felt afterward. But guilt wasn't enough to stop her. Clara's gambling addiction wasn't just about money anymore, it had become a way to cope with her stress, a cycle she couldn't break. Each time she stole from the school, she promised herself it would be the last time. Yet each time, she found herself drawn back in, unable to resist the lure of what felt like her only way out. Her addiction began to take a toll on her relationships as well. Friends noticed she was withdrawing from social events, colleagues observed her growing irritability, and students felt her once kind demeanor giving way to a distracted and distant attitude. Clara's world was crumbling, but she couldn't see a way out. She was drowning in debt, guilt, and fear, yet the thought of stopping felt impossible. And as her addiction spiraled further out of control, she made a decision that would change everything: to frame Mr. Carter for her theft. If you're engrossed in Clara's story and want to hear how this tangled web unfolds, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to bring you more gripping, real-life stories like this one. Clara's decision to steal from the school was not impulsive, it was calculated, a desperate act driven by the need to fix everything that had gone wrong. In her mind, this was the only way out, the only way to silence the voices of guilt and desperation that echoed in her head every night. As the weeks went on, Clara's grip on reality loosened, and her addiction to gambling consumed her every thought. The school, once a place of joy and purpose, became just a means to an end. Each morning, as she walked through the familiar hallways, Clara knew that she had access to the funds that could pull her out of the mess she had created. The school had a petty cash fund, money set aside for school activities, supplies, and small emergencies. It wasn't much, but to Clara, it was her ticket to one more chance. The first time she dipped into the funds was terrifying. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the safe where the money was stored. She knew the combination well, having used it for various administrative duties. The hesitation was brief, just a fleeting moment of doubt before she punched in the numbers and opened the lock. She could almost hear the ticking of the clock, the seconds counting down to her decision. Clara carefully counted out the money, almost apologetic for each bill she took. But the apology wasn't for long, within moments, the money was in her pocket, and she was walking back to her desk, feeling the rush of a plan that had worked. She transferred the money into her bank account and began to gamble immediately. The first time, she felt the thrill of victory, as if she had finally found a solution to her mounting problems. But that brief victory came at a steep price. Clara's desperation to keep winning grew stronger, and soon she couldn't stop. With each loss, she convinced herself that the next time would be different. She needed just a little more money to get ahead, to cover her debts, to make it all right. So, the thefts continued. Clara's meticulous planning began to show. She knew how to cover her tracks, changing the numbers in the school's financial records, falsifying reports to make the missing funds look like a simple clerical error. She was so careful, so methodical in her deception, that she almost convinced herself it wasn't wrong. But with every stolen dollar, the weight of her actions grew heavier. She started to panic, worried about getting caught, and began avoiding the very people who once admired her. Teachers who had relied on Clara for guidance were now noticing her increasing detachment. The students who had once seen her as a trusted mentor were becoming more aware of her erratic behavior. Yet, despite all the warning signs, Clara pressed on, unable to stop herself. Then came the moment that would seal her fate. In a fit of desperation, Clara took more than she ever had before. She emptied the entire petty cash fund. The money that had been set aside for school events, for students' needs, was gone. And that's when Clara made the fatal decision, to blame Mr. Carter. Her colleague, Mr. Carter, had always been kind to her. He had a reputation for being the dedicated, hard-working teacher who went above and beyond for his students. He had no idea that Clara was harboring such dark secrets, nor did he know that he would become the scapegoat for her crime. Clara, in her panic, saw him as the perfect person to frame. He was well-liked, trustworthy, someone whose word everyone would believe. And Clara, ever the manipulator, knew exactly how to create the illusion of guilt. She planted evidence in his office, a few receipts from the school's financial transactions that she could easily associate with the missing funds. She even fabricated a story about Mr. Carter's involvement, playing on his occasional absences and his disorganized paperwork. The moment she decided to frame Mr. Carter, Clara felt an eerie sense of relief. The burden of her crime seemed to lighten, even if just for a moment. The thought of him taking the fall for her actions, of his career and reputation being ruined, gave her the hope that she might get away with it. She would get the money she needed, and Mr. Carter would bear the blame. But even as Clara constructed her narrative, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her gut. Was she really going to get away with this? Would Mr. Carter, the man she had worked alongside for years, fall victim to her lies? And now, as Clara awaited the inevitable fallout, she couldn't ignore the cold, hard truth: the path she had chosen was irreversible. Mr. Carter had always been the kind of teacher who put everything into his work. He had dedicated years to helping his students grow, always staying late after class to answer questions, offering extra tutoring, and attending school events, even when he didn't have to. His devotion wasn't just to teaching, it was to his students, to their futures. He believed in the power of education to change lives, and that was his driving force. So, when he was suddenly accused of stealing from the school, everything that he had worked for, everything that had defined him, seemed to crumble in an instant. At first, Mr. Carter couldn't believe it. He had just finished a class when he was called into the principal's office. The school's administration, which he had trusted and worked alongside for years, seemed distant as they handed him the news. "Mr. Carter, there have been discrepancies in the financial records, some missing funds. We found receipts and evidence suggesting your involvement." He listened in stunned silence as they described the evidence, most of which had been planted by Clara. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what was happening. He was the one who always went above and beyond for his students, the one who volunteered for everything, the one who had a reputation for honesty and integrity. How could anyone think he was capable of such a thing? The accusations didn't just sting, they shattered him. Mr. Carter's mind was overwhelmed with confusion and hurt. How could Clara, someone he considered a colleague, even think of implicating him in such a crime? They had worked together for years, shared conversations, and supported each other in moments of difficulty. Yet now, he was being accused of something so severe. As the investigation dragged on, things only got worse. The staff, many of whom had once seen Mr. Carter as a mentor, began to look at him with suspicion. Whispers followed him through the hallways, and even his closest colleagues, who had once trusted him implicitly, now questioned his character. In meetings, some seemed reluctant to speak up for him. There was an undercurrent of doubt in every conversation. People weren't just questioning the theft, they were questioning Mr. Carter's integrity, his career, his very identity. The weight of the accusation hung heavy, pulling him into a pit of despair that seemed impossible to escape. The students, who had once adored him, started to distance themselves. Some were outright scared, unsure of who to believe. Others were angry, confused by the sudden turn of events. How could their trusted teacher be involved in something so terrible? It felt like the betrayal was personal. His home life was no refuge either. Mr. Carter's wife, initially supportive, began to question everything. They had built a life together, grounded in trust and mutual respect, but now she was filled with doubt. Were they really as close as they thought? If her husband could be accused of something like this, what else could be hiding in their relationship? His children, too, felt the sting. Their father was no longer the respected teacher they had been so proud of, now, he was just another man under suspicion. The fallout of the accusation extended far beyond the walls of the school, seeping into his personal life in ways he hadn't imagined. And through all of this, Mr. Carter had to maintain his innocence. He tried to defend himself, but every attempt seemed futile. The evidence, though planted, appeared convincing. His absences from school, small, unremarkable personal matters, were twisted into something sinister. His financial transactions, which were all above board, were scrutinized under the harsh glare of suspicion. As the investigation wore on, it became clear that the school was inching toward a decision. The administration was under pressure to act, to resolve the situation quickly before it further tainted the reputation of the institution. And all the while, Mr. Carter was stuck in limbo, trapped between defending his innocence and trying to keep his life together. But in the silence of the night, when he was alone with his thoughts, Mr. Carter knew that his life was no longer his own. The man he was, the teacher he had always been, was being consumed by the lies of one person. As the days dragged on, the burden of the accusation began to wear him down. The stress was taking a toll on his physical and mental health. He couldn't sleep. His mind raced with questions: was this truly the end of his career? Would he ever be able to rebuild his life? Despite all of this, Mr. Carter never gave up. He fought, tirelessly and silently, in the background. He knew that the truth would eventually come to light, but with each passing moment, the damage to his reputation, his career, and his family deepened. And that was the true tragedy of it all. If you're moved by the emotional journey Mr. Carter is enduring and want to hear how the story unfolds, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to stay updated on more compelling stories like this one. The investigation into the missing funds began to pick up pace, but the whole process felt like a slow-moving train, one that carried the weight of a broken reputation and a community on edge. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable resolution. But even as the pressure mounted on the administration to make a decision, new details began to surface that painted an increasingly complex picture of the crime. From the moment the theft was discovered, Clara had done everything in her power to cover her tracks. She was meticulous, often sitting late in the quiet school building, carefully erasing records, creating false documentation, and planting misleading clues to point toward Mr. Carter. She had calculated every move, convinced she could escape the consequences of her actions. But no matter how hard she worked to bury the evidence, cracks began to appear in the narrative she had so carefully crafted. The first sign that something wasn't adding up came from the school's accounting department. When they went through the financial records, they realized that the discrepancies Clara had planted weren't as airtight as she had hoped. The records that pointed to Mr. Carter's involvement were too neat, too convenient. The amounts involved seemed disproportionately large compared to his position, and the timing of the supposed thefts lined up almost perfectly with his brief absences from the school, absences that, when looked at closely, turned out to have perfectly reasonable explanations. The administration started to feel that something wasn't right. Clara's nerves began to show. She had always been a confident teacher, beloved by her students, admired by her colleagues, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. When one of the staff members noticed something odd about the way the money had been transferred, they decided to dig deeper. The pattern of the transfers didn't match the usual procedures for handling funds at the school. It was clear that whoever had stolen the money had not only manipulated the records but had also gone out of their way to hide their tracks, yet they had missed one crucial detail. A small but significant detail, a financial trail, which Clara had overlooked, led straight back to her. It was a simple receipt for a gambling transaction, a receipt that had been tucked into one of the school's financial records, perhaps in a moment of careless haste, after Clara had used the stolen money to feed her addiction. As soon as this new evidence surfaced, the investigators took a harder look at Clara. The cracks in her story started to widen. Her initial confidence, the way she had been so sure of her ability to blame Mr. Carter, began to fade. At first, Clara tried to dismiss the receipt as a mistake, something insignificant. But as the investigation continued, her excuses became less convincing. The pressure mounted, and Clara's ability to maintain her composure started to crumble. She was walking a tightrope, and every step she took threatened to send her tumbling into the abyss. Meanwhile, Mr. Carter, though still under suspicion, had begun to gather his own pieces of evidence. He had gone through his own records meticulously, piecing together his schedule and the few interactions he had with Clara around the time of the thefts. He knew that if he could find just one crack in the case against him, he could expose the truth. The investigation wasn't just about finding out who stole the money, it was about piecing together a story that made sense, a story where the truth could rise to the surface. Then, a breakthrough came. A staff member, who had been observing Clara's behavior over the past few weeks, remembered a conversation that had stuck in their mind. Clara had been unusually secretive, constantly avoiding conversations about finances and school budgets. They remembered seeing her in the vicinity of the school's safe on more than one occasion, always acting suspiciously when she thought no one was looking. With this new piece of the puzzle, the investigators were able to narrow their focus on Clara even more. They found surveillance footage that showed her near the safe multiple times, always at odd hours, always with an air of nervousness. In a final attempt to divert attention away from herself, Clara became even more defensive, claiming that Mr. Carter had always been a bit too eager to take over tasks that weren't his, suggesting he had found an opportunity to steal and pin the blame on her. She even went so far as to manipulate a few of her colleagues into believing the fabricated story. But it was too late. Clara's web of lies was beginning to unravel. The mounting evidence, her gambling receipt, the financial discrepancies, the surveillance footage, finally pointed in her direction. The school administration, now fully aware of Clara's guilt, began to turn their attention to her. With every passing hour, the walls closed in. Clara could feel the weight of the truth bearing down on her, and though she tried to cling to her lies, the truth was unstoppable. But just as Clara realized that her actions had caught up with her, a final twist occurred. A colleague who had been suspicious all along came forward with a critical piece of evidence, a document Clara had tried to destroy but had failed to completely erase. As the pieces came together, Clara realized that her time was running out. There was nowhere left to hide. The truth was coming, and nothing she did could stop it. The moment of revelation was unavoidable, and it hit like a thunderclap. Everything Clara had worked so hard to conceal, every lie, every careful manipulation, was about to come undone. The investigators, armed with irrefutable evidence, gathered the school's administrators and faculty to make an announcement that would shake the foundation of the entire school. Clara, who had once been a beloved teacher, stood in the center of it all, her facade crumbling beneath the weight of her actions. The room fell silent as the principal stood before the gathered crowd. The tension in the air was thick, palpable. It was a moment that had been building for weeks, and now, the truth was about to emerge. Clara Benson, the principal's voice was steady but firm, "You are hereby accused of embezzling school funds, which you used to feed a gambling addiction. The evidence against you is overwhelming." Clara's heart sank as those words hit her like a sledgehammer. She had tried to convince herself that she could get away with it, that the lies would be enough to protect her. But standing before everyone, with the weight of the truth finally being exposed, she knew there was no escape. Clara was escorted out of the room as the administrators presented the facts to the rest of the faculty. The gambling receipts, the manipulated records, the surveillance footage, every piece of evidence painted a damning picture. But it wasn't just the facts that stunned the staff, it was the emotional toll of the betrayal. Clara had been a role model for so many. She had taught for years, leaving a lasting impact on students and colleagues alike. To think that someone so respected had been hiding such a dark secret was a blow no one was prepared for. The faculty members exchanged shocked glances as they processed the revelation. Some had suspected that Clara had been acting strangely, but none of them had imagined the extent of her deceit. There was a collective sense of disbelief, mingled with anger and sadness. How could someone they had trusted so completely turn out to be capable of such betrayal? But perhaps the hardest part of it all was the revelation that Clara had framed Mr. Carter. For days, he had endured the shame of being falsely accused. His reputation, carefully built over years of hard work and dedication, had been tarnished. He had been forced to defend himself, explain himself, even as the mounting evidence seemed to point in his direction. All of it had been part of Clara's desperate attempt to cover her tracks. Now, the truth was undeniable. Mr. Carter had been innocent all along. And yet, the emotional damage to his reputation was already done. He could never fully erase the stain that had been placed on his character, no matter how much the truth came to light. As the full scope of Clara's betrayal sank in, the school community was left to pick up the pieces. The pain of the past weeks, of suspicion, of anger, of the erosion of trust, lingered long after Clara was removed from the school. Clara, in the face of the overwhelming evidence, could only break down in tears. The guilt, the shame, the regret, it all came crashing down on her. She had dug her own grave, and now she had no choice but to fall into it. She had lost everything, her career, her reputation, her friends, her dignity. And for what? To feed an addiction that had consumed her from the inside out. The emotional toll was undeniable. Clara had once been a beloved teacher, admired by students and staff alike. But now, all that remained was a hollow shell, a woman broken by her own actions. In contrast, Mr. Carter found a strange sense of relief in the truth being revealed, but it was bittersweet. His name had been cleared, but the damage to his career and relationships couldn't be undone. The trust he had once had in his colleagues had been shattered. There would always be a lingering question in the minds of those who had once believed in him: what had really happened during those tense days of accusation? It was a moment of reckoning, for Clara, for Mr. Carter, and for everyone involved in this tragic story. The school had been rocked to its core, but now it had to move forward. There was no going back to the way things had been. The betrayal, the lies, and the loss would leave scars that would take time to heal. The lesson was clear: trust, once broken, is difficult to repair. And addiction, when left unchecked, can lead to devastating consequences. If you're still with us, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to see how the aftermath unfolds. Clara's fate is sealed, but what about Mr. Carter? What does the future hold for him after everything that has happened? Stay tuned for the final chapter of this heartbreaking story. The fallout from Clara's actions was more than just professional, it seeped into every aspect of her life. The walls she had so carefully built around her career and her relationships collapsed with a single revelation. No longer the respected teacher, Clara was now a cautionary tale. Her actions had not only destroyed her career but had also deeply hurt the lives of those around her. The first major consequence was the loss of her job. The school board had no choice but to terminate her employment immediately. The emotional weight of that moment hit Clara harder than anything else. She had spent years building her career, pouring her heart and soul into teaching, only to have it all stripped away because of a compulsion she could no longer control. It was one thing to lose a job, it was another to lose a career built over decades. The disillusionment was deep. But the damage didn't stop there. As the truth spread, Clara faced legal consequences. The embezzlement charges, combined with the framing of an innocent colleague, led to criminal charges. The court proceedings were an agonizing reminder of how far she had fallen. Clara, once an admired teacher, now sat in a courtroom as a criminal. Her public defender worked tirelessly to try and minimize the damage, but there was no avoiding the inevitable. Her actions were too severe, too well documented. She had broken the law, betrayed those who trusted her, and caused irreparable harm. The worst of it all was the emotional toll. Clara had always prided herself on being someone people could trust. Her colleagues, her students, even the parents who had placed their children in her care, all of them now saw her through the lens of betrayal. How could they ever look at her the same way again? Clara's shame was not just for her actions but for the irreversible damage she had done to the bond she once held dear. But the emotional wreckage didn't end with Clara. The pain was just as real for Mr. Carter, whose name had been cleared, but whose reputation had been permanently tainted. Despite the truth coming to light, the damage to his career couldn't be undone. The school community had already begun to question his character, and that doubt remained in the minds of many. He had lost the trust of colleagues who had initially rallied around him, and though the accusations against him had been proven false, the stigma lingered. Even though Mr. Carter was exonerated, the emotional scars ran deep. He had been forced to defend himself during a time of intense public scrutiny, and though he had done nothing wrong, it had taken a toll on his peace of mind. For weeks, he had endured the agony of being accused of something he hadn't done. His career had been thrown into turmoil, and his relationships had suffered. Colleagues who once saw him as a role model now questioned his ability to trust or be trusted. Mr. Carter also had to rebuild his reputation from the ground up. The truth had come out, but the emotional cost remained. Rebuilding that trust wasn't going to be easy, and he knew that it would take time, maybe even years, for him to regain the respect and camaraderie he once had. His family, too, had been affected by the fallout. The strain on his marriage, the whispers in the community, the constant need to reassure his loved ones, these were the quiet battles he fought every day, even after the storm had passed. However, there was also a glimmer of hope in the aftermath. Clara's downfall, though tragic, had served as a wake-up call for the school community. The administration had implemented tighter controls on finances and stricter oversight to prevent something like this from happening again. The teachers and staff, while shaken by the betrayal, had begun to come together, realizing that trust and transparency were the foundation of a healthy work environment. For Clara, though, there was no simple resolution. She had entered rehabilitation, seeking help for her gambling addiction. It was a long road to recovery, and there were no guarantees that she would ever find redemption. But she had no choice but to try. She knew she had destroyed her life, and now the only way forward was through accountability and a genuine effort to change. But even as she sought help, she faced the emotional toll of knowing that her actions would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her future remained uncertain, clouded by the choices she had made in the past. The ripple effects of Clara's actions extended beyond the school. Her friends, her family, and even the students she had once cared for found themselves grappling with the truth. Many had trusted her, and the betrayal was deep. Some of them would never fully forgive her, while others would try to understand. But in the end, the pain of losing someone they had once admired was hard to bear. And yet, there was a silver lining amidst the destruction. The experience had changed the lives of both Clara and Mr. Carter in profound ways. Clara's fall from grace served as a stark reminder of the power of addiction and the consequences of unchecked behavior. Mr. Carter, though scarred by the ordeal, found strength in his resilience. He had weathered the storm and emerged stronger, his faith in his own character unwavering. For the school community, the aftermath was a hard lesson learned. Trust, once broken, takes years to rebuild. Addiction, when ignored, can destroy everything in its path. But it also showed the importance of justice and the strength of truth. Clara's story, painful as it was, became a cautionary tale. It reminded everyone that even the most respected individuals could be hiding their own battles, and that no one is invincible. If you're still here, don't forget to like and subscribe. The journey of recovery, the rebuilding of lives, and the long road to redemption continue, and we'll be here to take you through it all. As the story of Clara and Mr. Carter comes to a close, we are left to reflect on the impact of their choices, the consequences of their actions, and the emotional toll that both of them endured. This tragedy is a reminder that no one is immune from making mistakes, and even the most respected people can fall from grace. But it's also a story about redemption, change, and the power of confronting one's demons. Clara, once an admired educator, lost everything because of an addiction she could no longer control. Her gambling, driven by the thrill of winning and the desperation of her debt, led her to betray her colleagues, her students, and herself. It was a path she never intended to walk, yet one that seemed inevitable once she had crossed that first line. She became a symbol of how an unchecked addiction can turn a seemingly successful life into one full of pain, loss, and regret. On the other hand, Mr. Carter's journey shows us the resilience of the human spirit. Wrongly accused and forced into a public battle for his integrity, he faced humiliation and a loss of trust from those around him. But he refused to let the accusations define him. Though the emotional scars of the ordeal remained, Mr. Carter emerged from the storm with a renewed sense of purpose and strength. His story is one of survival, of finding your way back when everything seems to have crumbled beneath you. Their stories are intertwined in a tragic web, but they also offer valuable lessons for anyone willing to listen. Clara's descent into addiction and the crime she committed may have been driven by desperation, but it was also the result of her inability to face her problems head-on. Her actions were a reminder that ignoring the warning signs and not seeking help can lead to devastating consequences. But her story doesn't end with the destruction she caused. She now faces the daunting task of rebuilding her life, brick by brick, with the hope that change is still possible. For Mr. Carter, the experience taught him the importance of truth, integrity, and resilience. He stood firm in his belief that his actions were right, even when everyone else doubted him. His story shows us that no matter how dark the storm may seem, there is always a way out if you stay true to yourself and never give up. This narrative also calls attention to the broader issue of addiction and its far-reaching consequences. Gambling addiction, in particular, can often be overlooked or minimized, but Clara's story underscores just how destructive it can be when left unchecked. It's a stark reminder that addiction doesn't just affect the individual, it ripples out and impacts everyone around them. The people who love you, the colleagues who trust you, the community that depends on you, they all feel the consequences when addiction takes hold. For the school community, the fallout from Clara's actions was a hard lesson in the importance of transparency, trust, and the need to be vigilant when it comes to signs of trouble in the workplace. It was a wake-up call for everyone involved. And as painful as it was, the experience brought about a necessary change. New systems were put in place, new policies were implemented, and the school learned from the mistakes of the past. Ultimately, Clara and Mr. Carter's stories serve as a reminder of the power of choice. Each decision we make has the potential to shape our future, for better or worse. It's easy to look at someone's actions and judge them from the outside, but the truth is that every person carries their own struggles and demons. What matters is how we respond to our challenges. Do we face them head-on, or do we let them drive us to places we never intended to go? As we close this chapter, Clara's story reminds us that redemption is possible, even if it requires the hardest work of all, facing the consequences of our actions, taking responsibility, and committing to change. Mr. Carter's journey shows us that even when everything is stacked against us, we can still find strength in our character and in the truth. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with us. We hope this story gave you something to think about, whether it's the importance of recognizing addiction, the power of resilience, or the value of maintaining integrity in the face of adversity. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications so you won't miss any of our future content. There's always more to uncover, and we'll be here, ready to share more powerful, emotional stories with you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.